There's gold in that CDP. That's long been the rallying cry for customer data platforms. But the AI era demands more. Intelligent action is now the key, and fueling it, first party data. Done right, this rich resource enables a flywheel of innovation that improves processes, experiences, and most of all, profit. Learn more on this episode of Future Proof.
The future is here already. It's just not evenly distributed. Yet. Today's world teems with innovation. The nexus of hardware, software, and human ingenuity promises a revolution in possibilities. What does tomorrow look like? Witness Future Proof.
One thing is for sure, data is still the foundation. Data still is the core of information systems. Now we've seen some wild and woolly developments with all these large language models and the fact that they are probabilistic as opposed to deterministic, meaning you get a different answer when you put the same data in sometimes, and that's an interesting nut to crack in and of itself. But one thing that we know for sure is that data is still the foundation of information systems, and customer data is really important stuff. So-called first-party data, for example. We're going to talk about that today with a gentleman named Derek Slager. He's the CTO and co-founder of Empirity, a company I came across a few years ago doing some really interesting work and in what they call a highly opinionated data pipeline. So you guys have a customer data platform and you help companies leverage the power of their first party data. So let's kind of start there. Derek, where did the idea come from? How did you get into the customer data platform space?
Yeah, thanks, Eric, for the nice introduction. We started way back in 2016, which feels like yesterday and feels like a long time ago at the same time. What's interesting is the motivation to start Amperity was talking to customers, and it was amazing how consistent we found frustrated customers who wanted to do more with their customer data, who were experiencing the frustration of having frustrated customers who are saying
Mm-hmm.
things like, "Hey, why are you sending me an email telling me to buy the thing I already bought?" Or why aren't you
Right.
personalizing the experience for me? Why do I have to do all that work myself? And kind of all the usual things that we probably experience as consumers. And we talked to people at really impressive consumer brands, with great reputations, lots of technology in their stack, and they were still failing to create that customer experience that their consumers demanded. And so, as we kind of dug deep with them and tried to understand the problem, it became pretty clear that it was a data problem. Right? They had
Mm.
all kinds of systems to go do stuff with the data, but the problem was the data was fragmented all over their organization. In 2016, a lot of people were kind of building their data lakes and co-locating the data, but
Mm-hmm.
there's a difference between co-locating the data and making the data useful. And so,
Mm-hmm.
in essence, we started Amperity to help these frustrated, leaders at consumer brands build unified data assets, and since then we've built a lot of capabilities on top of that to help them go and drive the optimal customer experience. So the neat
Right.
thing is, in very nearly 10 years of building this business, and I say this as a good thing, it turns out that's an infinite road, to try and drive consumer experience, because expectations rise, right? You hit
Right.
six, and then consumers expect more, and I love that. Keeps the world moving forward, and gives us lots of opportunities to innovate. But in
Yeah.
the end, we think of our business as helping our customers maximize the return on their customer data, which is
Yeah.
their kind of unique, differentiated asset, and really, kind of the core of what drives customer experience is how well you use your data.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, I'm old enough to remember Customer 360. We were talking about that
Hmm.
25 years ago. Well,
Yeah.
we could get some good data about customers back then. One of the challenges, of course, is that you have all this SaaS sprawl. Software as a service is everywhere these days. I mean, how many are in the MarTech these days? Is it like 6,000? I lost count. Literally thousands and thousands of applications. They all have their own data model, their own schema, their own way of doing things, their own way of processing information. So CDPs, customer data platforms, they come in very handy if you elegantly connect them to your other systems. So, we're
Yeah.
going to talk about first party data today and really trends. We want to talk about trends in the
Yeah.
marketplace, but that is a major trend, first party data, because for a long time, it was just not very clean, not very well maintained. You have systems of record like Salesforce that are prodigious in the marketplace. Salesforce is just freaking everywhere, but it's hard to get the data out of Salesforce. It has its own little way of viewing the world. And that's, I think, why customers look to customer data platforms. That's why
Right.
enterprises do to kind of help solve all that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an astute observation. And it's interesting. Sometimes I remind people like digital experience, digital marketing, the digital world is still kind of new, right? Like, you mentioned 25 years ago, and look, for a lot of companies 25 years ago, their digital assets were a list of email addresses and not much more than that, right? The
Right.
world was kind of simple back then, and it's easy to forget at the pace of innovation and technology how many new things have come along. Marketing automation, different channels, evolution in e-commerce platforms, et cetera. People have built these things up over the years, and each one of those, to your point, kind of became a system of record. And so, you kind of rewind, let's call it 10 years, to kind of the early introduction of CDP. And it really, in its early days, was just saying, you got all these different systems of record. How do we kind of compose the data in those together so we can just ask some questions about it? And that was actually quite useful, right? But I think one of the challenges that we as an industry had was we've got systems of record, and then we had this kind of like early CDP system of composition. How do we go back out the other way? Okay, great. Now we've got consolidated data. We understand something about our customers. But how do we turn that back into action, right? And that became really difficult because you had to coordinate all of that kind of back into these systems of record, which were designed around their data model and their view
Hmm.
of the world. And
Right.
and very few of these, most of the systems in common use in enterprises today, were built in 2005,
Right.
and are still running on those architectures. And I'd say even sitting here in 2025, that's still true. So we've kind of patched these things together and tried to squeeze a lot of value out of them. But I think we're starting to see, particularly with kind of the push of the AI era, that people are going to be looking for more sophisticated ways to actually take that data and turn it into action.
Hmm. Yeah, well, you want to understand, again, the customer 360, which we talked about a quarter of a century ago.
Yeah.
We're a lot further along now. We have the capacity to pull information, we have the capacity to retrieve it very quickly. A whole bunch of dynamics have changed, like the constraints. I talk about this a lot on these shows we do. The constraints used to be that storage was expensive, processors were slow, even the network speeds were slow. All that
Yeah.
has changed now. Storage is cheap, compute is relatively inexpensive as well. You can ramp up, you can do all kinds of different things differently, but many times you still have the same systems of record that you talked about. So I think one trend line we're going to see is companies finding ways to leverage their first party data to create better customer experiences, and that can lean on a customer data platform like what you're doing. There are some other ways it can be done as well. But the AI you mentioned, especially
Mhm.
generative AI, because it's probabilistic, it's not deterministic. That requires guardrails. It requires the right amount of data at the right time to provide context to these agents to do their things correctly. Is
Yep.
that kind of where you're pivoting your organization as well to be able to deliver on traditional solutions and also feed these agents?
Absolutely. And I think actually it's all the same problem, right? It's all data, it's all context, to your
Hmm.
point. And so I think, and I see companies making this mistake sometimes, thinking, oh, there's an old world and a new world. Let's leave the old world behind and then like start building agents for things
Right.
and sort of forget about the data asset that we've been working on for a while. Like, no, agents are better with the right context and the right data, and the best context is going to come from organized, actionable customer data. Again, back to that's your unique differentiated asset. And so
Hmm.
I think people should be looking to to maximize the amount of context they can provide from their data, and then turn that into intelligent action. And
Hmm.
and so absolutely, I think part of the reason we're so excited is because when we say, um, what does it take to build a great agentic system that's going to deliver value to customers? Like,
Hmm.
we all kind of know the answer, right? It starts with great data, right? That's well organized and actionable. And so, we've spent, sort of the entire history of our company trying to build the absolute highest quality data asset possible. And then, we faced sometimes some friction if you build a beautiful, useful data asset and nobody uses it, was it worth it? Well,
Right.
no, it was a science experiment, right? And so, for us, the thing that's so exciting is now we can lower the barrier to turning that data into action.
Mm.
And it used to be, to the point about systems, right? We had to kind of go back into those systems of record on the edges and say, okay, we've created this rich data. Let's dumb it down and shove it into one of these systems that was built in 2005 that's going to take action. And so,
Hmm.
with the possibilities and the ability to kind of build on top of these foundations, we don't really need to do that anymore, right? We can just do that directly. We can take the action, kind of as part of the platform. And then, and parity and other CDPs, I think, certainly, and maybe this gets into some of the sort of, prediction topic. But if I look ahead, I think it's very clear that they're going to evolve into systems of intelligent action, and not just be kind of the data consolidation tools.
Right. Well, you bring up an excellent point here. And it's funny because this is a question I've asked for many years. And as I try to wrap my head around how these things are working, the point of action, where does the action take place? And to
Mhm.
your point, let's think about the history real quick before we go into the future, right? In
Yeah,
data warehousing, we realize we can't query these operational systems very well. So let's
right.
pull all that data into a normalized schema in a relational database.
Yeah,
We'll do our analysis there, come up with good ideas, and then go ahead and send that back to these other systems to do their actions. What you're
yeah.
saying is that what you really want is an engine which can pull in and rationalize this data and then take the action itself. So the customer data platform becomes the point of intelligent action to help the business, right?
Exactly right. And the reason that's so important is because, um, one, the closer the action is to the richest data view, the more that
Mhm.
data can utilize, the more
Right.
context it has, the more flexibility it has. But just as importantly, if the system that's taking action is integrated into that data layer, well, guess what? You've closed the loop. And now all of a sudden, you've created the conditions for that system to get smarter and smarter and smarter and smarter and smarter. So when we
Mm.
talk about intelligence, it's not just taking all the data that I have and kind of finding the right ways to slice it and dice it and the right actions to take. Great start. But then how do you use the information about what's happening to drive intelligent decisioning and to optimize and do many of those things on the fly? That has to be one system. You can't break that problem apart. Or if you do, it's going to be very, very, very slow.
Right.
And you're going to spend all of your time dealing with, integration issues, the mismatches and data models that you've already referenced, and, different systems having different views of the world. It's
Right.
very, very difficult to do that. It's like building a big complex distributed system, but there's no value, in that
Hmm.
out the other side. You're just dealing with compromises the entire time.
That's a good quote, actually. You're just dealing with compromises the entire time. That is no bueno, as we like to say on the
Indeed.
show. So this, I mean, you make a lot of sense, and I think that the good news for the customers out there, for the clients, is that we now have the capacity to do that. Because if you think about, so what does it mean to understand the customer and to furnish and enable intelligent action? Well, you have to know a lot of stuff. You have to know what the customer has bought. You have to know something about the demographics. You have to know what you have for sale today, for example. You have to be able to align these two things and
Yeah.
enable your marketing ops people to come up with good ideas for promotions. So, can you kind of get into that a bit? Like, what does it take to be able to analyze inventory that's available, promotions being put forward, prospects in your database with your first party data? Who is a likely person who would want this kind of thing? Can you just put some meat on the bones for how you enable that sort of thing?
Absolutely. And it's so interesting because what you're describing is so obvious, and yet so few people do it.
Hmm.
And it kind of gets to that sort of challenge of the systems of record. It turns out the inventory system is pretty disconnected from the system that's making decisions
Right.
how to move that
That's right.
inventory, is pretty disconnected from the system that's going to take action, is pretty disconnected from the system that's even going to analyze the results of that. And by the time all those layers have flown, have executed, the inventory probably changed along the way.
Right.
And
That's
so,
right.
so I think, one, most fundamentally, that has to be the same system. So, it can sort of track that data over time. Two, it actually has to be real time. And again, that probably sounds like an obvious statement, but I think as we have gone through the last 10 years, I think there was kind of big focus on real time. And then people realized, oh, the
Right.
state of technology in 2016, 2017 means I can't do everything in real time. And there's some real compromises in kind of doing things in real time. I'm missing some of the richness of data. And then we saw kind of the modern data stack and the rise of Snowflake, Databricks, other data platforms, which gave people sort of superpowers in the non-real time path.
Hmm.
And people indulged themselves in that, and I think built better quality data assets as a consequence of that. And now I'm starting to see real time really reemerge as a huge trend, because as we start thinking about combining data and action together, real time really matters, right? So back to your example, we have to know the real time inventory to be able to personalize in real time. The other thing, and this gets to the intelligence point, we can't pre-program everything.
Right.
And I have a front row seat to see what really sophisticated brands are doing with data, and a lot of it is pre-programmed, right? We have a little bit too much inventory on this product, so let's go make a list. And people do this today. Let's go make a list of the people who have the highest propensity to purchase this product. Let's build a journey, and using that journey, let's send out some messaging to see if we can move the product. If some time passes and we haven't moved enough product, let's start to discount, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and then you move through the product. That's pretty sophisticated,
Hmm.
by today's standards, but it requires a lot of planning, a lot of kind of architecture. You've got to build the campaign and build the creative. You have to have the idea in the first place about how to build that list. What about the lists you're not building, and so on and so forth. And so, I think what's really interesting to us as we think about this kind of evolution from system of record to system of intelligent action,
Hmm.
there's an opportunity here for sophisticated systems to be able to plan these things for you, build the campaign creative for you, and allow you to do those sophisticated things, but at a much larger scale and with much more kind of nuance and integration. Because the problem
Yeah.
is today, you don't have the resources as a brand to do anything that's going to hit fewer than tens of thousands of customers,
Hmm.
as a practical matter, and so you're missing opportunity there.
There's an economics play here about what is feasible and really plausible in an organization. How much time does it take your people? How many systems do you have to touch? What does the process look like building the data pipeline? What does the process look like deploying the promotion, tracking the promotion? All these things are very real, tangible, set processes that many people are accustomed to doing. And a lot of that stuff is batch. You kind of mentioned pre-programmed. You have to really kind of think through all this and set up all these stages, and all these people do different things. Well, now with some of the new automation that's available, you could do lots of different things much faster and even have the process of building the pipelines and the lists and the promotions and so forth be largely dynamic, where folks are just sort of monitoring and adjusting and fine tuning things as opposed to manually pushing something up the hill. That's a sea change. I mean, that is a dramatically different landscape. And it's kind of hard for some people even to change their mindset about it. What do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree. It really is a sea change, and I think as you kind of allude to there, I think right now people are pretty good at taking things they used to do and making them go faster, right? That's sort of the low-hanging fruit of AI today. Is everything we used to do, but it's faster and easier. But that's not the sea change, right? The sea change is when you kind of rethink what's possible. And
Mhm.
so, it is the case that when you're going through all these different planning steps, orchestrating different parts of your organization and different systems, you have to abstract things a lot. And your list sizes get very large.
Right.
And what are we trying to do with all these lists that we're building? Well, we're trying to approximate, what everybody talks about. One-to-one personalization, one-to-one personalization, one-to-one personalization. I hear that all the time. But nobody's actually doing one-to-one personalization, right? They're building lists of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people and trying to approximate it a little bit. And again, there's smarter and smarter ways to kind of build those lists, but they're all kind of grouping a bunch of people into these very coarse-grained categories, and we're all unique, right? Like if you take somebody else who has similar demographic attributes to me, we might not think the same way, or be into the same things, or be looking for the same products, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so many of these things get kind of simplified down to well, let's take all the 40 somethings in a, urban environment and
Right.
treat them all the same, right? And that's better than not doing that, but it falls well short of what's possible. Part of the challenge is, there's so many different constraints in the system. Creative is a great example. Many people have for years been telling me, I would love to do, kind of smaller segment sizes, but I only have capacity to build, so much creative, and that's really my throttle on how many different treatments I can have. And yeah, we can do a little
Right.
bit of dynamic content things here and there, but that's not really enough to be able to get there. And so, stating the obvious here, but I think one of the really exciting things about AI is creating possibilities to generate content and move those list sizes down, which also opens up the ability to have more sophistication in how those lists are selected, and
Hmm.
even in certain cases down to segment of one. And so, if you think about it to that level, if we're able to look at sort of the whole picture of a single customer and think about all the signal that we have, including importantly more and more unstructured data, as more and more people are using text, and conversations and chatbots to be part of their experience of discovery and engagement with a brand, that becomes an important source of signal. So, we're getting way beyond, oh, this person's a 40 something in an urban environment. This person is actually saying, hey, I'm looking for something with a more tailored fit, because I got healthy this summer, and I want to kind of rebuild my wardrobe. If that information is communicated in text, it's very difficult, to capture that in sort of the systems of record, where you'd have to create some
Right.
attribute for that, and it's
Right.
not practical.
Right.
If you zoom into the segment of one, and you have intelligent orchestration making decisions about how to use, understand, build creative, and build campaign execution strategies against that, you're in a completely different world. It's a huge sea change, and almost every aspect of the way people think about customer experience gets sort of rewritten when you really think from that one-to-one personalization lens.
Well, and so here's an interesting curveball I'll throw at you that brings in one of the big top trend lines, which is generative AI. I think you were kind of alluding to some of that stuff there. I've had this realization myself, and it is just gobsmacking the difference in architectural approach that you can take these days compared to the old days with the old systems of record. Because
Right.
you could have on a particular customer record just an open, endless field of text of comments that they make
Yeah.
at various times, and there's a timeline built in because of how it persists in there. But now you can have a Gen AI summary to so zoop, dip in there and find a few interesting things in almost no time and deliver that to the customer service rep, for example, or
Yeah.
bake it into an email. Point being, you don't have to over engineer the data side of the equation to leverage this unstructured data now. And that, again, is a massive change. I think very few people have really wrapped their heads around how big a difference that is to the old way of doing things. But what do you think?
I completely agree, and I think it's exciting, right? Because the technology is there today. We can do this.
Right.
We can do this today. I think some of the biggest challenges are organizational.
Hmm.
working differently requires sort of, having these pieces work differently. If you look at all these systems, right? We've talked a lot about these disconnected systems, these systems of record that have been around for, 20, 25 years and are still very much around today. Oftentimes those get partitioned up department by department by department, right? Because that's sort of what you had to do, to make the systems work. So, the team that's looking after the inventory system is a completely different team that's looking after the e-com system, which is
Right.
typically a different team that's looking after the marketing automation system, and so on and so
That's
forth.
right.
To say
Hmm.
nothing of the, kind of innovation teams who are building Gen AI experiments, which are, kind of completely disconnected from all of that. And so, um, we think from a systems perspective, the more all of that data is in one place, the smarter the system can be. We've talked about sort of combining the system of understanding with the system of action so that you can kind of close the loop. But then what happens to your organizational silos? Well, that's tricky. Are they all working in the same system? Are they
Right.
all, in the same room now, talking to each other and coordinating and planning? They probably should be. But in most organizations, they have decades of experience kind of operating in their silo. In
That's
many
right.
cases, operating in their silo against a set of incentives that might subtly or not so subtly compete with somebody else's incentives.
Hmm.
Oh, I'm in the email channel. I need to, touch the customer so many times to hit this certain metric. Maybe somebody, in one of the other channel teams is functionally competing, for that same customer's attention. And so,
Right.
kind of breaking down the technology silos also involves, breaking down some of the organizational silos. And, that may be the hardest part.
Yeah. Well, I think that's an interesting trend line to examine. And I've had the same exact thought that you will probably need more generalists as opposed to people who are really highly focused on one particular discipline or one particular technology stack. I think you're going to need to have people who are okay learning systems upstream and downstream from them to get a better understanding of the big picture and wear different hats. The
Yeah.
fact that you can now use these Gen AI engines to research almost any topic, and yes, they make mistakes, they do hallucinate, but you can fairly quickly ascertain when that's the case and when it isn't. But the fact
Yeah.
that you can do that really opens doors to new ways of coming up with new processes, new ways of coming up with new ideas, of bringing ideas to market basically. And that's
Yeah.
the general theme I'm seeing with all this AI that is now just infused everywhere is
Mhm.
do more experimentation. Don't be afraid
Yes.
to try new things, but
That's right.
just pay attention to what works and what doesn't, right?
Absolutely. And I think one of the neat things about applying, these new technologies in the space of customer data and personalization is the value of being right far outweighs the cost of being wrong. And
Hmm.
and you got to look at it relative to sort of the current state of affairs, right? Like, everybody's trying to, reach their customers and grow their business, and how good a job are they doing, right? And so, if you just to sort of make it mathematical, if you used generative AI, and kind of this new system architecture to improve personalization, and 95% of the time you did a better job, you've got 95 out of 100 customers who are like, wow, this is an incredible customer experience. And the
Right.
other 5%, right where you started. You're no worse off. And so, yeah, maybe you got the, kind of wrong product category, or you didn't quite get it right. But the value of the customer experience improvement for that 95% is overwhelmingly, kind of an asset to the business. And you actually have virtually no downside, in the remaining, because it's probably still at least as good as what you were doing before.
Hmm.
So why not?
Well, and also, and here's an interesting curveball I'll throw at you. Responsiveness is so important in marketing, in customer relations, in customer success. And so
Mhm.
let's say to your point, you do a new Gen AI infused program, you improve for 95%. Maybe you did upset one of the people in the 5%. If your team now has more time to focus on stuff, so they can be
Right.
personal on the
Yeah.
phone with customers, dealing with any sort of edge issues. And what I've learned is that responsiveness is like 90% of the game. So
Yeah.
if there's a mistake, you just get right on it. Okay, yeah, we implemented this new system. I'm sorry about that. That was crazy, but here's
Yeah.
what we can do for you. If you have your people focused on those edge cases and responding quickly to anything that goes wrong, you're still winning because
Yes.
now the customer sees, hey, they're on the ball, they're trying something new. Most people are pretty forgiving about mistakes as long as someone responds effectively in a short period of time.